So my talk today is inspired by the extraordinary space that we're sitting in here today, Mrs. M's salon. In presenting these objects through the eyes of a time-traveling ghost, this exhibition invites us to look at material objects in a new way, specifically in relation to time. In a traditional museum exhibition, when you look at a wall label, you'll find some basic information, a title, a maker, some information about materials and techniques, a date of manufacturer, maybe some other identifying and explanatory content. And this is great, but often it's not enough to explain what the history of these objects actually are. To create these neat labels, sometimes we have to nail an object down to specific facts and a specific timeline. But I wonder, what if the real story doesn't belong at only one point in history? What if the real story is more complicated? And so my topic today is going to be time. Over the course of, I'm going to talk for about a half an hour, I think, and then we'll maybe have some discussion. We're going to examine objects that seem to exist in more than one era, confounding viewers with their time-traveling powers. Some of these objects were created recently using older techniques. Others were made by artists who couldn't decide whether they were more interested in their own time or another one. And still others have so many layers of temporal significance that it is difficult to parse one historical moment from the next. And so today we're going to be probing the often fluid and sometimes frustrating relationship between objects and time. And I hope that we're going to come to multiple conclusions in the process. So I'm speaking and advocating for messiness today. But before we do, I thought I should explain a little bit about my own qualifications. As an art historian, the main thrust of my research concerns the memory of the American Civil War, especially as it pertains to soldier monuments. My current book project explores the afterlives of monuments that have stood in our cemeteries and town squares, and the various processes that materially affect outdoor sculpture, especially things like intentional vandalism, accidental destruction, deliberate revision or removal, and damage from neglect and the elements. But this isn't the only current that brings me here today. I'm also quite active on social media, and anyone who follows me on Facebook is aware that I'm a member of the steampunk community. So steampunk is a subculture that mixes 19th century technology with science fiction, imagining an alternate reality in which steam-based technologies became much more advanced. There's steampunk literature and film, but there's also in-person events that involve costumes, gadgetry, arts and crafts, and revivals of past entertainment styles, including things like burlesque and sideshow. And this is the part of steampunk that most interests me. Several times a year, I attend events as Dr. Nell Spaulding, a steampunk antiquarian who probably would have gotten along with Mrs. M. Or as her con artist brother, Captain Jeffrey T. Spaulding, who you might recognize as one of the alter egos of Groucho Marx. And so in my discussion today, I'm going to be incorporating thoughts from both the scholarly and the steampunk worlds as we think about objects and time. So we're going to begin with one of my favorite soldier monuments, the Minutemen in Concord, Massachusetts. The Minuteman was the first public monument that was created by a then 23-year-old Daniel Chester French, who would go on to become one of the most famous sculptors of his generation. Later on, he eventually ends up sculpting the statue of Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial, for instance. When we look at this, we see a young Revolutionary War soldier. But the real implications are a lot more complicated. This statue was dedicated on the battlefield in Concord on April 19th, 1875. So maybe speaking about it in this gallery that is so imbued with the idea of the Centennial, the Lexington and Concord Centennial is kind of the opening act to all of the Centennial celebrations. So we're 100 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord here, and those opening shots of the Revolutionary War. And this statue is very appropriate for that. What we see here is a young farmer who's grabbing his gun and almost leaping out the door to go and answer the call to defend his nation. Sort of a reverse of that story of Cincinnatus, in which the Roman general gives up his sword to return to his farm. This is kind of step one of that process, leaving farm, grabbing sword. And this figure he's lithe, he's long-limbed, he's youthful, he's joyful, maybe representing all of these ideas of a young nation, and really a fitting embodiment of kind of the dawn of America. But we can't forget that 1875 was also 10 years after the end of the Civil War. And this Minuteman ends up carrying Civil War associations as well. So the Civil War was the first major war in Western history where rank and file soldiers were recognized with their own figural monuments. Statues of soldiers standing at parade rest that spread all across the nation in, again, towns and cemeteries. And so statues of the Revolutionary War and of revolutionary soldiers came after the Civil War, inspired by these Civil War commemorative activities. Even further, this statue is actually literally made out of Civil War materials. Civil War cannons were taken and melted down to make the bronze to create the statue. And that was work that was done in a foundry that had produced swords for officers during the Civil War. So thus, this sculpture, which literally shows a soldier leaping away from his plow to go to war, so kind of reversing that biblical idea of turning swords into plowshares, is himself made out of war material that was melted down for the peacetime purpose of making a commemorative monument of a soldier heading off to war. So we end up with this like circular swords and plowshares thing going on here with this monument. And so this Revolutionary War soldier contains the DNA of Civil War battles in his material and in the inspiration for his creation. But we can push this even further. So on April 19, 1875, at the dedication ceremony for the statue, George William Curtis, who was the editor of Harper's Weekly, gave a keynote address that very explicitly connected the Revolutionary and the Civil War generations. Early on in his speech, Curtis evokes the fact that at the Battle Centennial, no living veterans are there to survive as tangible links to the past, unlike at the 50th or even the 75th anniversaries of the battle. And Lexington and Concord held these anniversaries on every single one of these important anniversaries. So for the young residents of Concord who had attended the earlier celebrations, when they thought back to these veterans that they met, they seemed like, and in Curtis's words, he said, that they were a little group of tottering forms, eyes from which the light was fading, arms nerveless and withered, thin white hairs that fluttered in the wind. So no resemblance to the brave Minutemen of history. But at the Centennial Celebration, something new had happened. This is just 10 years after the Civil War, and Curtis is looking out into a crowd that contains all of these young Civil War veterans. And these veterans in the crowd suddenly allow for a new understanding of the passions of the men of old. Curtis is having a strange moment where he's looking out into the crowd and seeing these young men and suddenly being able to see his ancestors and what they must have been like when they were young men heading off to the Revolutionary War. And he put it exactly this way. He says, "We do not count around us a few feeble veterans of the contest, but we are girt with a cloud of witnesses. We're surrounded everywhere by multitudes in the vigor of their prime, whose glory it is that they were Minutemen of American liberty and union. These men of today interpret to us with restless eloquence the men and the times we commemorate. Now, if never before, we understand the revolution. Now we know the secret of those old hearts and homes. We can measure the sacrifice, the courage, the devotion, for we have seen them all." So by looking at this object, we can have that same eerie time-traveling experience that Curtis felt as he looked out into the crowd that day and saw the faces of those young veterans looking back at him. The ability to imagine his forefathers as youthful revolutionaries in the guise of the Civil War generation spread out before him. And kind of connecting this to the contemporary day, I couldn't help but be reminded of this speech over the course of the past week or so, watching the news come in from the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into World War II. So we're going to be having that 75th anniversary experience over the next few years, thinking about World War II. And if I could have any one fervent hope, it would be that in 25 years, when we get to the 100th anniversary of World War II, there will not be the occasion for someone to give the same speech, looking out at a huge generation of young men. So there's one form of time-traveling objects. Another type of material experience that can evoke layers of time is the historical site. And I want to spend a little time thinking specifically in this case about Independence Hall in Philadelphia. This was originally built as the Pennsylvania State House, the most important civic building in the colony and then the state of Pennsylvania. And the site eventually became known as Independence Hall after serving as the location for many of the important events in the founding of our nation, including the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the meetings of the Continental Congress and the adoption of the United States Constitution. If you go there today, which I had a chance to do with some of my students a few months ago, you'll receive a tour that is all about these important events. First, you'll go into a room with a National Park Service employee who will give you some basic information about the Revolutionary War, and then you'll take a trip through the two main rooms on the first floor of the building. First of all, the Supreme Court room, and then the Assembly room, which in the parlance of our times is the room where it happened. And of course this makes sense. When interpreting a building that is so important to the founding of our nation, and which receives so many visitors, you have to stick to the basics and move people through as efficiently as possible. They have people going through every half hour, and there's at least like 75 people on each one of these tours, so they've got to be efficient. But anytime I visit, I always wonder how it might be if the National Park Service had the freedom to interpret other phases of this building's history, and if so, how that might look and what could be included. So you see, Independence Hall has been through many phases. And one of the most interesting took place when Charles Wilson Peel's family occupied the premises. A little context. In the first decades after the founding of the nation, the Pennsylvania State House was remembered as an important site of key events, but wasn't quite venerated in the same way that it is today. So it was one of the only really large gathering spaces in the city. People continued to use it for all different sorts of events and repurpose it for different kinds of events. And it wasn't really until 1824 when the Marquis de Lafayette came to visit and wanted to go and see the old places where these things had happened, that people were like, oh crap, maybe this is important. Maybe we should actually save this. So in 1802, when the Philadelphia artist Charles Wilson Peel wrote letter after letter to both the state and federal governments asking for a new site for his ever-growing museum that contained both science and art, they loaned him the State House, which was by then no longer in use as a government building. And on the second floor of the State House, in a long room that goes across the entire front of the building, that's where he installed his collection, an event that he memorialized in his 1822 self-portrait. And I think Charles Wilson Peel would actually love the space that we're sitting in right now. And his museum exhibits were arranged in kind of a Linnaean classification system. So on the bottom, there were cases that had kind of lower forms of animals, and as you went up the walls, the kind of cast of animals would get more important. And then along the very top of the window, there was a double row of these oval portraits that included the faces of illustrious American statesmen and military men. And, you know, I know it's crazy, but sometimes I really wish it would be possible to use space in Independence Hall to recreate Peel's museum, or to have some ability to remember this moment. And I think this really speaks to a key dilemma in preserving historic structures, which is that including, in choosing the era of the greatest historical significance for a building, one might miss other key eras in a building's history that were also really interesting or important. You know, buildings are living entities. They continue to exist, they continue to be used for periods after the moment at which they were the most significant. And sometimes it can be hard to decide how you're going to end up trying to dial things back to get to the moment that you want to have be the most important. And I wonder what we lose when we lock ourselves into a single interpretation of the site. Okay, so our next object comes from Gettysburg, which is another historic site that has its own set of questions about interpretation. But that's a really long story. And if we want to get into that maybe in the Q&A, we could talk about that more. And this next object also has a much more personal connection because it is a picture of me. Another way that objects can really confound the concept of time is when modern artists and artisans learn how to work with techniques and technologies from the past. And this is exactly what I have here. This is a tintype made using authentic 19th century processes by Rob Gibson, who is a photographer who maintains a studio in downtown Gettysburg. I sat for this photo on July 2nd, 2013. So the second day of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and itself a pretty strange and potent week of telescoping time. Pretty much all throughout the 3 days, I was thinking about resonances between the ways in which that little town had to deal with a huge influx of soldiers in 1863, and the same little town, which has the same limited resources today, having to deal with thousands and thousands of people who wanted sandwiches, for instance, in 2013. After we had this photo taken, we waited an hour for 2 subs. So on the day that I had this photo taken, I had a chance to watch Rob Gibson's process up close and to talk to him about his methods. In addition to his studio work, he also travels to reenactments and does demonstrations of Civil War era wet plate and tintype photography techniques wherever he goes. His camera is an actual 1860s model, and he knows that it was once owned by a Baltimore photographer who famously photographed Jefferson Davis. And he believes that this is the same camera. So, me being the Civil War nerd and also unrepentant Yankee that I am, the idea that I have sat in front of a lens that also looked at Jefferson Davis, maybe gives me mixed feelings, but is also really interesting. Gibson's photographs are confounding to the connoisseur of photography. He's mastered posing modern individuals to carry themselves in the way that 19th century Americans would have posed. And his studio props would be at home in a Matthew Brady gallery portrait. In fact, when I first showed this photograph to my PhD advisor, she suggested sneaking it into an archival collection somewhere to confuse future photo historians many years down the road. In using these techniques, Gibson has also had experiences in learning about historical photography that might be hard to access in any other way. For instance, he's learned how to pour collodion onto a plate without spilling a drop. And if you want to see him do that, there's a great video on YouTube where he explains his whole process. And just the moment where he pours that collodion and just goes, meh, 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 and not a drop goes off of it is just amazing. He's also had the stifling experience of working with noxious chemicals outdoors on a hot day in a close light seal environment. And maybe along with that, he's also commented on how flies are really attracted to the smell of collodion, which you might not know unless you are trying to use collodion on a stinky, hot July day. And that experience was also really instructive for me as well. I learned that using a pose stand is not uncomfortable at all, and is in fact necessary to keep the body still for that long exposure. And I also learned that once the lens cap comes off and you're sitting there for that long 15 seconds and counting down, it's pretty much impossible to keep your face from laughing, which I think maybe explains some of the really stiff expressions that we see in 19th century photographs. I could imagine those sitters having that same experience. So Rob Gibson is one of many photographers in the modern day who've revived the techniques of 19th century wet plate photography. And the results that these artists produce are often uncanny in their ability to leap across time and refuse categorization. And our next object takes that idea one step further. And with this, we head back into the realm of steampunk. So if artists like Rob Gibson adopt 19th century style and technique in order to study history or to create objects that fit in with the modes of the past, steampunk is more interested in borrowing 19th century language to tell a fantasy story. And this object is one of the great examples of steampunk crafts that I've seen, and I have seen this in person. This is a working model of R2-D2 from Star Wars that moves, blinks, beeps, and whirs, just like the original character. And maybe it's a good object to talk about on a weekend if there's a new Star Wars movie out there for us to see. So to get that steampunk effect, one turns away from the types of materials and aesthetics that are common in modern sci-fi, and instead turns back towards the Victorian era for all kinds of inspiration. Wooden parts, brass finishes, hinges, gears, gauges, and when creating costumes, top hats, ruffles, lace, crinolines, bustles maybe, depending on which area you're in, and always goggles, because you need to keep all the dust out of your eyes when you're flying your airship. And part of the fun for members of the steampunk community when you meet at conventions is to discuss the anatomy of one's costumes or props, to explain how the different parts were manipulated in order to create the effect of the garment you're wearing or the object you're carrying. So, a typical conversation might be like, oh, I got this hose from Home Depot. Oh, you see this little doodad? That came from a craft store, and I spray painted it to make it look like metal. And so part of the fun is going through and looking at all these collages of objects and kind of figuring out where they come from. And if you're ever thinking about getting into steampunk, as was true for Victorian aesthetics as well, in steampunk, more is more. If Coco Chanel once advised us to look in the mirror and take one accessory off before we go out the door, the steampunk version would be look in the mirror and add one more thing, or maybe more. And as with the steampunk R2-D2, inspiration for costumes and props often comes from other types of fandom, especially comic books and sci-fi films. Folks who are attracted to steampunk events also tend to be members of other major fandoms in today's widespread geek culture, and so there tends to be a lot of crossover. I've seen steampunk versions of Marvel characters, characters from Doctor Who, Star Wars, Harry Potter, and a lot more, you name it. And so my own decision to cosplay as a variation of Groucho Marx is a nod to this practice and a nod to what a lot of steampunks do, but kind of making it personal, because for me, the Marx Brothers were one of the major touchstones of my childhood. And so taking Groucho and transporting him from the 1930s back into the 1890s didn't really feel all that difficult. So that's something I've been doing for a couple of years now. Now, I think that folks are drawn to steampunk from a lot of different directions. For me, it came from the fact that I spend so much of my time researching and writing about the 19th century, and I was looking for an outlet where I could explore some of my interests in a bit of a more playful way. I do have friends who are in the reenacting community, and I find myself deeply interested in their activities, but I prefer the freedom of steampunk to be inventive and playful with history, rather than trying to conform to a specific idea or to have the wool of my jacket be exactly the right weight or things like that. And as for the culture at large, I see a blend of nostalgia and modern technology happening at the same time. So people might dress as Victorians, but then use their iPhones to take pictures and then post them on Instagram. So definitely a little bit of everything. There's also many aspects of millennial culture that are deeply rooted in nostalgia. Things like the search for the artisanal and the handcrafted in food and in objects, the vogue for 19th century beard styles, the desire for authentic experiences, and the revival of older forms of entertainment. And you see all of this happening in steampunk. But there's also a desire to create an alternate version of the past, with values that are more like our values today, and in which anyone can be who they want to be. And even as we look toward the past for aesthetic inspiration, we're also more connected with one another by modern technology than ever. And I don't think that many folks in the steampunk community are looking to give up those connections anytime soon. I think this space in which we sit, Mrs. M's cabinet, appeals to my steampunk sensibilities because of the way that it uses a fictional overlay to give its visitors a new way to look at history. And I think when steampunk is working at its best, it can really help to do kind of the same thing. All right. And I'd like to end my talk today on a bit of a more serious note. As we think about the ability of objects to transport us through time and to provide insight into more than one era, one thing to keep in mind is that these processes can often open up painful wounds in the social fabric. One way in which this has been clearly evident over the past year and a half has been in debates surrounding the future of Confederate monuments in American cities. This most recent outcry began in June of 2015 in the wake of the shooting of 9 parishioners of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, for which Dylan Roof was convicted on all accounts this week. In the wake of the shooting, many Confederate monuments were targeted with graffiti connecting Confederate history with the Black Lives Matter movement, drawing a link between the horrors of slavery and the epidemic of police and vigilante violence against Black Americans. There have also been many calls to remove the monuments, and a few cities, including Louisville, Kentucky, and New Orleans, have begun to move forward with plans for removal. Some cities have compromised by adding new explanatory text to monuments or commissioning new works of art to offer additional perspectives on historic sites. But the lesson that we should take away here is that objects play a tangible role in the ways in which history is remembered and interpreted, and this process can be deeply painful. For some Americans, the Confederate monument stands not only as a reminder of a dark moment in the nation's past, but also as a nod to the work that remains to be done, and the ways in which currents that allowed slavery to happen are still present in American society. So this is another way in which objects telescope time, to remind us perhaps of how far we have left to go. And so in our conversation today, we've looked at several objects: a Revolutionary War soldier monument made possible by a Civil War context, a major national historic site that might hold more stories than we can see when we visit it, a tintype by a modern photographer that leaps backward and forward in time, a work of steampunk crafts that posits an alternate reality, and a vandalized monument that challenges us to think critically about the ways in which we interpret objects in history. We've seen that objects can confound time in many ways, by giving us insight into the experiences of our ancestors, by revealing multiple layers of time and meaning, by using old techniques in order to make new work, and by forcing us to confront the ways in which the past informs the present. And so with all of this in mind, let's return to our own research and interpretive work with an eye on the ways in which the relationship between objects and time may be messy, and the ways in which we as historians of art and material culture can allow that messiness to become part of our working practices. Thank you very much.